So what this law does is it ends that trauma, it ends that pain, and it means that women are safe from prosecution when acting in relation to their own pregnancy.
Hello and welcome to In Solidarity. I'm your host, James Battershill. Before we get started with today's episode, I'd just like to remind everyone that if you enjoy what you hear today, don't forget to subscribe on your podcast platform of choice and to leave a review and share with your friends. It really helps us with getting discovered. So today I'm super excited to be presenting this episode because we have a special episode in that we get to talk about some good news. So I am joined by Sian Norris. She is an investigative reporter at openDemocracy, and she is the author of Bodies Under Siege. We're going to be talking about the momentous decision made by the UK Parliament to decriminalise abortion in England and Wales. So Sian, it's so nice just to be able to be living through a historic moment and it not to be like a bad historic moment for once.
Yeah, absolutely. This is really a huge achievement for women's reproductive rights. And when I was watching the vote last night and discussing coming on the podcast today, it really reminded me of in 2022 when we had the opposite with the US Supreme Court decision to end this right to safe and legal abortion nationwide in the States. And I was on a podcast just after that. And I remember like just the pure rage that I felt. And it was so obvious in my voice when I was talking on this podcast how angry I was. And so to come on and talk about abortion in a positive way and to see rights being forwarded and to, see access being improved and women's safety being protected, it's a very different mood, and that's really lovely.
Yeah, it's absolutely awesome. So hopefully we'll have no reason to have any rage today. Something that I noticed when I was talking to someone about this vote by the MPs, they said, oh, I thought abortion was already legal in the UK. Is that something you've come across? Is that a fairly common point of confusion?
Yeah, so the laws in England and Wales around abortion are quite complicated. It's really important to remember that we do have the right to safe and legal abortion in Britain, that women can access abortion and that it is legal to access abortion and has been since 1967. But what the 1967 Abortion Act did was it legalised abortion in specific circumstances. So in order to get an abortion in England and Wales, you have to get the consent of two doctors who will confirm that continuing the pregnancy will be more harmful to a woman's physical or mental well-being and health than ending the pregnancy. And it has to take place before 24 weeks, except in really specific circumstances such as threat to the mother's life or severe fetal anomaly. Up until around 2022, it was also the case that the abortion had to happen on registered medical premises. That changed in 2022 after a temporary lifting of that restriction under the pandemic. So if you accessed an abortion outside of the restrictions in the 1967 Abortion Act, for example, if you did not get the consent of two doctors, or you ordered abortion pills online, or you had an abortion after 24 weeks, but it was not to do with medical reasons or threat to the mother's life, then you could end up being prosecuted under two Victorian and 1920s laws. And in that case, you can face up to life imprisonment.
Okay, so how does last night's vote change this?
So what was so important about last night's vote is it ends the criminalisation of women who act in relation to their own pregnancy. It doesn't change the 1967 Act. It will still require women to get the permission of two doctors to have an abortion, and the 24-week limit is still in place. But if a woman takes action outside of those restrictions, she will no longer be prosecuted. She will no longer be threatened with arrest, with prosecution, criminalisation, and imprisonment. Now, it's really important to understand that the kinds of cases that we're talking about are very rare. A woman acting in relation to her own pregnancy does not happen very often. But when it does happen, it's often to women who are in really, really difficult circumstances. This could be a woman who's in a domestically abusive and coercive controlling relationship, who's been denied access by her abuser to medical services. And in desperation, she, takes pills that she's bought online. Or it could be women who have, severe mental health issues, who have just not been able to conceptualize getting access to help and have just not been able to get access to a legal abortion. There is absolutely no public interest for prosecuting those women and to sending those women to prison. And yet that's what the existing laws allow to happen. So what this law does is say, if you are in that situation, if you have taken action to end your own pregnancy outside the restrictions, you will be safe. It's also really important because when women do make these very desperate decisions, they might end up, like having bleeding, they might end up in medical problems. And they're too scared to go to healthcare settings. They're too scared to call a doctor because they're afraid that they'll be arrested. So it takes away that fear, which means women can access reproductive healthcare in really difficult situations. We've also had multiple cases where women who have not ended their own pregnancy deliberately, who've not taken abortion pills, who've not sought an abortion, but have miscarried or had unexplained pregnancy loss or stillbirth and have still been arrested and investigated. And of course, that cannot be right either. We cannot have women who are experiencing, the distress and grief of miscarriage and stillbirth suddenly being hauled up in front of, courts and police. So what this law does is end all of that. It ends that trauma, it ends that pain, and it means that women are safe from prosecution when acting in relation to their own pregnancy.
How often do we see these laws actually be enforced? Are they enforced on a fairly regular basis?
I think this is a really important question to explain, like the why now. Why has this vote happened now? Why has there suddenly been an increased push towards decriminalisation? Now, decriminalisation is something that the pro-abortion movement has been asking for a long time, but in recent years it's become much more urgent. And this is because we have seen a huge increase in the number of women being arrested and prosecuted under abortion, anti-abortion laws. Between 1967 and 2022, there were only 3 women in court under the anti-abortion laws. Since 2022, there have been 6. So that's a big increase. It's a small number, but it's a big increase. But more importantly, we've seen around 100 investigations into illegal abortions or unexplained pregnancy loss since in the last decade. Now, that is a massive increase from where we were before. So we've seen a big push of criminalisation. Again, they're small numbers, but every single one of these women is experiencing trauma, is experiencing distress, and is being unfairly criminalised for acting on her own pregnancy or, experiencing unexplained pregnancy loss. And so the more we've kind of seen the increase in these arrests and prosecutions, the more urgent the push for decriminalisation has become. And that's why it's so important that MPs voted for this last night, because it sends a message that these women will no longer be criminalised and that women have rights over our own bodies.
Excellent. As you'll be well aware through your kind of like work writing Bodies Under Siege, there's always a contingent who push back against these kind of changes to the law. Something that we kind of hear fairly commonly, I think, is around that kind of like 24-week onwards timeframe and, people having a problem with abortions taking place after those 24 weeks. What is like the reality of that? How common is that?
So the vast, vast majority of abortions happen within the first 10 weeks of pregnancy. That's around 88% will happen within the first 10 weeks. Only 0.1% of abortions happen after 24 weeks. And those are the abortions which I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, where there's a threat to the mother's life or a, severe fetal anomaly, and therefore an abortion is permitted. And very, very few abortions happen between 20 and 24 weeks because, as I say, the majority are happening very early on in pregnancy. I think during the debate last night, the issue is a sort of post 24 weeks and whether women should be criminalised and whether there should be a criminal punishment for women who have abortions in that time period was raised repeatedly. And one of the moments that really stood out was a Lib Dem MP called Angus MacDonald, who said, what if a woman decides at the full term of pregnancy to have an abortion because it's an inconvenience? Like, this just does not happen. Like, no woman is getting to like that late in pregnancy and going, oh, do you know what? It's inconvenient for me to have this baby now and I'm going to have an abortion. I mean, it's just not an issue that happens. What we are seeing when we deal with the reality of where women are, it is, as I say, these women in very desperate situations who need compassion and care rather than criminalisation. I think that, when we look at the statistics, the majority of later abortions are related to, health reasons, whether that's mental or physical health, or really, really difficult situations, such as maybe a teenage girl who just couldn't admit that she was pregnant and just didn't get help in a timely manner. I don't think we should be looking at these women and seeing them as people who should be punished. We should be looking at them as seeing as people who need support. And the more access to abortion, the wider access we have to abortion, the more abortions will happen in the earlier phase stages of pregnancy, which is what we've seen, the bigger increase in abortions happening earlier and earlier in pregnancy. And so access and decriminalisation is always the way to go in order to protect women.
So last night's vote wasn't just about this. I think there was an amendment that was put forward by the Conservatives to reverse telemedicine abortion access. Why is telemedicine important?
Telemedicine was brought in as a temporary measure during the COVID pandemic because, obviously at that time there was huge pressure on the NHS, and it was a way to ensure that women who needed to access an abortion did not have to go for an in-person appointment at a point when, trying to get a doctor's appointment or a healthcare appointment was very loaded. I mean, we can all remember what it was like in March 2020 and that sort of fear of getting to the doctors or, putting pressure on the NHS. So what telemedicine allowed was for women to have a telephone appointment with her doctors. You'd still need the two doctor sign off. You'd still need that consent from two doctors, but you could get pills by post, and you could take the abortion pills in your own home, as opposed to the previous law, which said the first pill had to be taken in medical premises, and then the second pill could be taken at home. And even that was in advance on what it was previously. In 2022, there was a vote to continue that and to make it a permanent change, which was a really significant win for the pro-abortion movement. And that's because telemedicine is really important in many ways for women's access to abortion and to access to safety and health. The first is that when you had to take abortion pills at a doctor's surgery or at a clinic, you would hear like awful stories of women who would suddenly start losing the pregnancy, on a bus or in a supermarket. I mean, these are stories that women have told me. So being able to take the pills in the privacy of your own home meant that, you were in a safe space to have the abortion. The second thing goes to the sort of more issues around vulnerability. Now, again, if you are a domestic abuse victim and your partner is refusing to let you go to the doctors or refusing to let you get a GP appointment to access abortion, telemedicine gave you a discreet way to have a GP consultation or a doctor's consultation, get your abortion pills, and not be under threat. It's really positive for women who live in rural areas, particularly women on low incomes. If you're living in a remote space where there isn't a great bus service, where your doctor's surgery or your reproductive healthcare clinic is far away, telemedicine meant you were able to access abortion care without the kind of long hassle of having to travel for abortion. And so it was a really good measure in order to protect those women and to make sure we had better access. Now, what the anti-abortion movement tries to do is say that telemedicine is bad for women's safety. It says that it allows bad actors, including abusive men, to get abortion pills without, anyone seeing the woman who's pregnant, um, and to kind of force women to have abortions. Now, there was a really, really horrific case where this did happen. There was a man who was arrested and, charged and convicted because he got a woman to pose as his partner in order to access the abortion pills via telemedicine, and then put the abortion pills in his partner's drink and obviously forced her to have an abortion. That would still be a criminal offence under the amendment that was, voted through last night. But it is important to recognise that there are these horrific cases, but these horrific cases do not outweigh the huge benefits of telemedicine, particularly to those vulnerable women and domestic abuse victims. And when you look at, the evidence from the Violence Against Women Coalition, from Rape Crisis, from various domestic abuse charities, all of them sing from one hymn sheet on this, that telemedicine is better for domestic abuse victims because it allows women to have control over their own bodies and control over their own reproduction.
Excellent. So last night's vote was obviously awesome news for women in England and Wales. What does it mean for the UK on a global stage?
I think to me, it's a really important moment because globally, we have seen this backlash against abortion rights. And I opened this podcast by talking about the Dobbs decision in 2022 from the US. And that has emboldened the anti-abortion movement internationally. And that's including in the UK. And we see increasing US influence even on the UK debate over abortion. So for the British government to stand up and say, no, we support a woman's right to choose. We believe that women should not be prosecuted and criminalised for accessing abortion. We want to expand abortion access, so that women feel safe. I mean, they didn't vote to expand abortion access, but, by ending the criminal prosecution, that is in itself an expansion. And to say, that we believe that women have a right over their own bodies is a really important statement to make at this moment, because it's saying that we are not going with that US tide. We are not going with the anti-abortion movement's ideas and ideology. We are standing up for women's rights to bodily autonomy. And at a point of backlash and where we do see these constant attacks on women's rights, I think it's a really important thing for the UK government to say what they believe and to vote in support of women's rights.
I'm going to take a slightly pessimistic tone on this. Sorry, I can't help myself. So last night's ruling was that this is like an intent to make this law. So it's not actually law just yet. How does this sort of thing work in Parliament? Could this be overturned? Could it be blocked? Are we going to like wake up tomorrow and we're going to be doing a opposite podcast where we're like having to say that this has all been undone? What happens next, essentially?
So I have to admit that my grasp on parliamentary procedure is always a bit challenged. I really felt that last night when I was watching Parliament live and being like, oh gosh, like in and out, vote this, vote that, what are they on? But I think there's a couple of things. So yes, this is an amendment to a bill that is going through Parliament, the Crime and Policing Bill. And so this has now been added to the bill, and it will be part of the bill that will then hopefully be turned into an act. And so it's not like today we woke up and the law was changed. It is still in process as the Crime and Policing Bill goes through the House of Commons and then to the House of Lords and then back to the Commons and then gets royal assent. But I think what last night's vote shows is that the government and Parliament supports the amendment. It was won by a huge majority. So the fact that it could then suddenly have a majority voting against it is very, very unlikely. And also, because abortion issues are always a free vote in Parliament, they're not whipped. The government was not going to stand against this. The government, as a Labour government, was very unlikely to stand against this anyway, because Labour government is traditionally pro-abortion, even though it has anti-abortion MPs, and that is their right. But it's also, in the 2019 manifesto, it committed to decriminalisation. I don't think it was in 2024, but I could be wrong. But they will not interfere with the passing of this amendment because it is a free vote and it won't be whipped, and therefore everybody votes with their conscience. Now, in some ways, there's a debate as to whether abortion should be a free vote and a conscience vote, or whether it should be treated as other healthcare votes, but that's a debate for another day. But I do feel that, the way that last night went, the fact that it had such mass support from the Labour Party and from other smaller parties in Parliament, and the fact that the government has said it will not interfere with the passing of the amendment means that we are looking at decriminalisation when the Police and Crimes Bill goes through, or Crime and Policing Bill goes through.
It's so good just to be able to celebrate a win for women's rights, particularly in a world where it feels like maybe it's just our exposure to it through, the work that we do. But, they seem to be more under attack than ever. But what's next? Where do we turn our attention now? What should we be looking into next, for the next battle for women's rights?
So what was really interesting about the amendment, NC1 amendment, is that it is a very narrow amendment, and that was intentional. It was narrow in that it said all this is going to do is take women out of the criminal justice procedures when it comes to abortion. It's not amending the 1967 Abortion Act. It's definitely not repealing the 1967 Abortion Act. It's not creating wider law reform around abortion. It was a very simple demand. Women should not be criminalised. This will change that. What I am hoping, and what I think the next step will be, is to go for that larger reform. Now, that's complicated because as soon as you open the door on abortion, all the anti-abortion movement jumps in, and any kind of attempt to amend the abortion laws is at risk of it becoming a regressive move. So it has to be done really carefully, and that's why NC1 was so careful. It wasn't trying to do anything too big, because it was like, as soon as you did that, it's like, well, what about the upper time limit? What about introducing mandatory counselling? What about having mandatory ultrasounds? All these things that anti-abortion activists try and get into the laws in order to restrict access. But we know that the public is on the side of the pro-abortion movement. The British Social Attitude Survey says that 90% of the British public support abortion access in some forms. And I do think that there is an appetite for greater reform. And so my hope is that we can build on last night's win to say, yes, we have come so far in decriminalisation. Now let's have a look at these laws, which we have to remember the 1967 Act was really groundbreaking when it came in, but that was in 1967. I met David Steele, he passed the Act in 2018, and he was talking about, how at that point, something like having an abortion on a medical premises was vital because it meant women weren't dying in back streets. It was so important to make sure abortions happened in hospitals. That's not so important now because we have abortion pills and because, abortion is a lot safer than it was in 1967. So these are things that have evolved in the time period since 1967, but there's still more to do. And I think what I would like to see, and what I know lots of pro-abortion activists and MPs would like to see, is the next step, and to have proper abortion law reform. But we have to do that with the very clear knowledge and understanding of the risks, so that when we do make that step, we have mitigated those risks, and any change can be only positive for women, as opposed to opening the door for a rollback.
In Solidarity is produced by James Battershill, Ayodeji Rotinwa, and Carla Abreu. And the theme song is Odyssey by Edward Abela. If you enjoyed today's episode, please don't forget to subscribe to the show on your podcast platform of choice, and also leave us a review, share with your friends, just do all of that, good internet stuff. If you've really enjoyed the episode and you want to help support us in making more of them, you can do so at opendemocracy.net/donate. And if you want more great stories like this from around the world delivered direct to your inbox, why not subscribe to the Open Democracy newsletter at opendemocracy.net/newsletters. Thank you so much for listening, and have a great day.